One of the toughest things I think for leaders to do is to discern between what their model is and what their mission is. That's where you see that inevitable curve downward. And the thing that has caused me to be so passionate about innovation is to think about what does it look like to create new curves and new opportunities for growth to accomplish the mission.
Welcome to the Lausanne Movement Podcast, where we have a passion to accelerate global mission together. If you like today's episode, won't you take a moment to rate and review our podcast and subscribe? That way you won't miss a thing. And now, for today's interview. Well, Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
I'm really excited to dive into today's conversation, not only because you're here to help us think through our own organizations and ministries becoming more innovative, which I love seeing within the ministries I'm involved with, but also you are a podcast host of the Purpose and Profit podcast, which I was telling a friend of mine earlier this week is one of my favorite podcasts to listen to. And so if anyone here is listening to this or watching this and is looking for a new podcast, I want to encourage you to go check out Dave's podcast, Purpose and Profit. It's excellent. You would enjoy it. But we are here to talk about innovation. It's great to have you with us. To kick us off, could you start by sharing a bit about yourself and how you developed a passion for helping nonprofits and organizations become more innovative?
Absolutely. You know, Jason, as I just think about the journey that God's had me on over the last 42 years, but really the last 20 years of my career, the consistent theme has been helping leaders to connect the dots between where they are today and where they're headed tomorrow. And just the way that I've been wired, from a child, I was always interested in sort of new things. And it's been interesting as I've gone through my career. I spent about 18 years in a marketing and fundraising role, helping ministries and nonprofits do more of what it is they do. So helping them to support and fund their missions. And then I've spent the last couple of years advising and consulting and teaching and writing and speaking on these issues. And I think the reason that innovation is so important to me is because every organization, every institution, every church is on an organizational life cycle curve. It's just a circle of life sort of a thing where you start in infancy, rapid growth, but inevitably every organization, every model goes through a slowing, plateauing, and decline stage. And that's just a reality of life. It's not good or bad. It's just, it is. And the thing that has caused me to be so passionate about innovation is to think about what does it look like to create new curves and new opportunities for growth to accomplish the mission that our organizations are called to. And so a lot of that for me has been marketing and fundraising and business and technology, but through the lens of innovation.
So I'd like to begin this conversation by just framing it for everyone. You've already mentioned a bit about why innovation is so important, but I really want to kick this conversation off by setting it up right. Why should organizations and ministry leaders be intentional about thinking about innovation? In your opinion, why is this the most important thing or one of the most important things for them?
I heard a quote from a leader many years ago, and this was in the corporate commercial sector, that she was new to the organization and she was being interviewed and she was asked the question, like, what do you feel like is the most important task, in front of you? And she said, well, I think the most important task in front of me is the most important task in front of every leader. And that is to manage the present while inventing the future. And I thought, wow, okay. That in a moment that described what I felt like I had been called to and I had been challenged as a leader in my organization. What does it look like to manage the present and invent the future? And I'm convinced we are all, based on how we're wired and our experiences, we tend to lean one way or the other. We tend to bias personally towards, well, I'm looking to the future and maybe I sometimes forget about the present, or sometimes I'm so enveloped in the present that I'm not thinking about the future. And so every leader is wired differently, but that's, you combine that with how this organizational life cycle curve means that organizations are not, your model is not inevitably going to work forevermore. And so it's important to be able to think about what does it look like to manage the present and invent the
Yeah.
future.
So we're going to dive into the whole organizational curve and life cycle of organizations and ministries a little bit later on. But I just love how that definition connects with what is your passion, which is connecting the dots, getting you from where you are today, tomorrow, right? And that is the task of every leader. We can ride the wave of today, but it's at some point, if you've ever seen surfers, that wave is going to end. And so we got to figure out how we can continue that cycle of surfing and getting movement going. I believe that many leaders might feel intimidated by this term innovation. I know I certainly do. You know, we are told we have to be innovative, we have to be creative, we have to predict the future, and it's a lot of pressure. When you discuss innovation in nonprofits, what are you really referring to? What does innovation look like in practice?
I'll give a definition to it, but Jason, I love your surfing metaphor. I think you know, and our listeners may not, but I literally write a weekly report on what's happening in leading and technology, and it's called the Wave Report for a reason. And so we're going to come
That's
back.
That's probably where I got it from.
We're going to come back to surfing in a minute. But, you know, when I think of innovation, there's so many definitions. I think there is both a micro innovation and a breakthrough innovation. I always resist one singular definition, but I was just reading a book recently, and a gentleman who here in the States was head of innovation at this company called Chick-fil-A. And those of you that have been to the States, you may know there are a lot of passionate fans about this organization, great mission and Christian roots as well. But the gentleman, his name's Michael McCathron, said this. He said, I think we're all basically trying to answer two questions. And that is, are we doing the right things? And are we doing things right? And I thought, wow, okay, that in some ways is a definition of innovation. It's, are you doing the right things? Which is the most important question, by the way. We can really perfect doing the wrong things or the maybe mostly right things, but not the right things. How can we make sure we're doing the right things and do them in the right way? And so innovation might look like a brand new model way of doing things, and it does sometimes, but it also can look like an incremental improvement, a test, an experiment, a way of doing things. And so it's both the big and the small, but it's what are the right things, and then are we doing them in the right way?
Yeah, you know, and as you were speaking, I was just thinking about some of the organizations that I've worked in, and we've done the right things in the right season, but they're not necessarily the right things in the next season, right? And so we can continue perfecting things that were good 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but for now, there needs to be new life birthed into it. And I suppose that's what we're speaking about here, going from where we are to where we want to be and doing the right things in the right way today, right?
Yeah. Well, and let's bring it back to surfing, okay? You mentioned this sense of overwhelm, and I hear this from leaders. By the way, I feel this regularly. I speak on, how to use artificial intelligence in fundraising and marketing and what, the subscription economy is doing to the way donors behave. And so I'm always thinking about the waves, but it can be overwhelming. And if you've ever, by the way, been to the beach and, swam in the waves, it only takes being blindsided by one wave to feel completely overwhelmed and underwater and you can't breathe. Yeah, and it can be really discouraging. And so, one of the lessons that I learned from the world of surfing that I think we can apply to innovation is that not every wave is worth catching. And I think as leaders, we tend to listen to a podcast like this or read an article and say, oh man, I'm missing out, or I've got to get on that bandwagon. I need to do that thing. And maybe you do, by the way, that's why we explore and learn. But more often than not, it's a wave that is coming or that is here. But when you watch surfers in the water, and Jason, in South Africa, I know there's some pretty good surfers, and certainly growing up in the West Coast of the United States, there's some good surfing spots. And you watch surfers in the water, and at first I thought they were lazy, Jason, growing up. I was like, why are they just sitting there? They're like just chilling.
Lying around in the water, yeah.
Yeah, and when I'm in the water, I'm like panicked and trying to, survive and catch every wave and I learned that one of the things that they're doing is they're picking their waves. They see the waves that are coming, but they don't feel this urgent desire to catch every wave. Not every wave is the right wave for them. And so I think for leaders, that can be a really helpful release to say, hey, not every wave is for me. You can miss a wave by trying to paddle too early just as much as you can miss a wave by paddling too late. And so release some of that pressure, some of that, I've got to do this now. And there are moments where, you probably should do that now, but we just get this feeling of like, I've got to do this and I've got to do that and I've got to do this other thing. And it can become overwhelming and cause us to actually, very ironically, miss waves because we're too exhausted or too distracted or spread too thin to be able to catch those waves.
Well, I mean, I suppose those who are listening have been to some of those Christian ministry conferences, and there's always great people on the stage doing amazing things, and you go back to your own space and you think, well, let me do what they're doing here, and it doesn't necessarily work, and you might get discouraged or you might get overwhelmed by all these amazing things. And I suppose what I hear you saying is there's the reality, and we've got to be watching the waves. We've got to be watching what's coming, learning as we're going. We can't keep our eyes off the ocean because that's a dangerous thing in surfing. And we've got to see what's right for us. And so we've already started unpacking some of the myths that are associated to innovation. What are some other myths about innovation that you often find yourself debunking for nonprofit leaders especially? And how have you advised these leaders to overcome them? As they're beginning to feel, they might feel anxious about being more innovative or needing to do new things. How do you come in and help settle them by explaining to them what is really innovation and what the myths are and what aren't?
I mean, there are a number of myths, I think, that as leaders, we tend to believe that honestly tend to hold us back from innovation. One of those that I talk a lot about is that there's a myth, and that is innovation is only about new things. It's the latest technology, it's the newest technique, and there is something to be said about new things, but, scripture says there is nothing new under the sun. And so I think we can learn a lot more from studying ancient history in innovation than I think we can honestly learn from the last 5 years of technology inventions. And so one of the myths I think leaders think of is I got to know what came out last month and what new tech tool is going to change my life. And don't get me wrong, again, as somebody who talks about how we can use technology to transform the way we do things, that's important. But I think we can learn a lot more from people like Filippo Brunelleschi or Leonardo da Vinci or Martin Luther about how those people responded and how those people were able to innovate. I'll give you one example from the life of Martin Luther. I think most people tend to think of Martin Luther, at least like me, in the sense of, he was born at a time where this new technology had come out, the printing press, and he was able to leverage this new technology to spread a message that he was passionate about, which is true. But if you study his life, one of the things that you see that I think is a hidden insight that gets lost is that Martin Luther was surrounded by contemporaries, by collaborators that made the work that he did and the work of the reformers before him and after him possible. So, you mentioned going to a conference and seeing a big leader on stage and hearing, all the wonderful things they're doing. And I think, I don't know if it's a Western thing, Jason, but it's certainly a human thing that we tend to have this myth of the lone innovator. Like in the United States, we have Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. These people have like singularly reinvented the world. And when you study any of their stories, you see that they're surrounded by dozens, sometimes hundreds of collaborators that are bringing their gifts to the table. So Martin Luther, I'll just give you an example. Martin Luther had a friend and a colleague in Wittenberg, Germany, named Lucas Cranach. And Lucas Cranach was the local artist. He was a court artisan, but he was also an entrepreneur. And the thing about Lucas was that by the time Luther had sort of risen to prominence, Lucas had one of the largest art production shops in all of Germany. And he also invested in local print mills because he saw the power of the message that Luther was trying to spread, but also the practicality of if we don't create print mills, which can then create, or, paper mills that can create more paper that we can then print on and spread the message, we're going to have a problem. So without Lucas Cranach getting ahead of, candidly, the sort of business and sort of logistics side of the work that Luther was doing, we might not have ever heard of Martin Luther. And so you look at any of these innovators, air quotes, in life, and you really study them, and you realize they were surrounded by collaborators. And so I think we can learn a lot from that. So I think the main myth that, I try to debunk in this area is that innovation is new. It's not new. It's ancient.
Yeah, I mean, I so appreciate that. And, even as you were speaking about Martin Luther, I mean, it almost felt, as I've read his story, that innovation happened to him. He didn't go around looking for it. He he put his treaty up onto the church wall, but someone else took that and was innovative with it. And that's how that message spread. And, the other thing that I appreciate about what you said is this idea of there's nothing new under the sun. And on a personal level, I always felt that I was not a creative person because I wasn't artistic in school, or I couldn't draw that picture, right? Because that was like how creativity or innovation, if you translate it into like a more adult sense, that's how I understood it. But then I realized, I think it was from a GLS conference, there was someone who was speaking about innovation and creativity. And he mentioned that, nothing is new under the sun, almost like you did, and how the only person who has created something out of nothing was God himself. For the rest of human history, it's always been humans creating something out of something. And to take ideas, to hear what is being spoken about and contextualize that within your own space, that is creativity and innovation. I don't know if that resonates with you, if that is that a helpful way of thinking about innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other, you're making me think of another myth I speak on pretty regularly, and that is that innovation is about ideas, like the breakthrough idea, the next insight, which again, there is a place for ideas and insights. That's something that I love to do. But innovation is also about execution and activation. And there's a gentleman who actually has spoken at the Global Leadership Summit that you mentioned. His name's Patrick Lencioni. Some of our listeners will have heard of him. He's written a number of books, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, The Advantage, The Ideal Team Player, Patrick Lencioni. And he recently came out with a book called The 6 Types of Working Genius. And this is a model that I've personally used in my advising practice with the organizations that I work with, but that I've also used as a leader of teams. And the short version of the model, just to illustrate this idea that innovation is not just about ideas, is that you have 6 different types of work that we all have to do. And in order to get anything done to accomplish the mission that our organization is called to, we have to do parts of all 6 of these types of work. However, each of us is created and gifted and wired particularly for 2 of these types of work, are what they would call our working geniuses. These are those God-given strengths, those things that really motivate us, that we love to do, we do naturally. Then 2 of the 6 would be called working competencies. So yeah, we can do those things. We might be pretty good at them, but they may not excite us. And then 2 of the 6 then are what are known as working frustration. So these are things that maybe we're not more naturally wired for, or we don't spend a lot of time with. Doesn't mean we're bad at those things, by the way. A lot of leaders have learned through behavior and experience to be good at all 6 of these things. But when you lean into your genius, you have the opportunity to really go much further. And those geniuses, and this is where the ideas and activation come in, those geniuses range from the first genius, which is called the genius of wonder. The genius of wonder says, like, they're often the people with their head in the clouds, candidly, because it's like, I wonder what's going on over there. I wonder if we're doing the right things. They ask a lot of questions, which, by the way, if you haven't figured it out, that is one of my geniuses. I love to wonder. But the next genius is so important, because the genius of wonder asks the question. The next genius is the genius of invention. And the genius of invention, if the genius of wonder says, I wonder if we're doing the right thing, or I wonder if we could do this better, the genius of invention says, I've got an idea. Like, okay, here's an idea. Here's 10 ideas. And these are people that are great at generating new ways of thinking and new ways of doing things. And that's what I think most people tend to think of innovation as. But the reality is there's 4 more geniuses. The next one is the genius of discernment. And that is saying, is this the right idea at the right time? Right. And that's so important. Sometimes the genius of invention comes up with a lot of great ideas, a lot of waves, Jason, and they may or may not be the right time or the right wave. That's where you need the genius of discernment. The next genius is the genius of galvanizing. Galvanizing is this idea that, okay, this is what we've decided. We're going to rally the troops. We're going to motivate everybody. We're going to move forward. Galvanizing, by the way, is one of my frustrations. It's not something that I love to spend a lot of time on. I think, oh man, if you can't get your own energy to, do the thing, then I don't know how to help you, right? And then the final two geniuses are the genius of enablement, which is the coming alongside. How can I help? How can we make this thing happen? And then the final genius is the genius of tenacity, which is getting stuff done, checking the box, making sure things get done. And if you look at innovation in your nonprofit or your organization or your business, and you struggle with execution, you might want to look at your team dynamic and see if you're missing some galvanizing, some enablement, and tenacity. Likewise, if you're really good at executing and you get stuff done really well, but sometimes you get blindsided by, the changing world or new technologies or new models, then you might have some gaps in your wonder and invention and discernment side. And so the myth is that innovation is just ideas and creative thinking and, no bad idea. But the truth is you do need ideas, but you also need activation and execution.
Yeah. And it's one thing to have a great idea, but if you can't implement it, right, then what's the point of great ideas? And so, yeah, I mean, we've, in both my church and within Luzon, especially the group that I'm working in at the moment, we've done the Working Genius, and it's really been beneficial. Not only because it allows you to see how you're wired, but it also helps you see how you and your team are wired together and what you can rely on, what you can work with certain people on the team. And so I found it very, very helpful. And so I'd encourage anyone listening to check it out. So Dave, I want to talk about the S-curve of organizational life. You've mentioned it as we've unpacked in the podcast. Could you dive into that a little bit and help our audience understand that a little bit better?
Absolutely. I don't want to assume everybody is familiar with it, but if you imagine a curve that starts at the bottom of a graph and from left to right, it curves up into like a hockey stick type of a shape. It curves up, but then ultimately it starts to lose steam and then slowly plateaus and then heads downward. That is the curve that I was referring to earlier. And if you think of any institution, like I said, whether it's an organization or a church, and you can see how an institution will create one sort of approach or model, and often that will be new and innovative and interesting, and it will create great impact and growth. But ultimately, over time, those models all tend to slow down. And so one of the toughest things I think for leaders to do is to discern between what their model is and what their mission is. And so if they get too focused on the model and they think their model is their mission, that's where you see that inevitable curve downward. And it can be extraordinarily difficult, but if you can separate that and understand what your ultimate mission is not the same thing as your model. So to use a business example, if you think of the company AT&T in American Telephone and Telegraph, right, was the original name of the company in North America here. That was originally a telegraph company, like they pulsed Morse code over wires. Ultimately, that led to then telephone, and then they realized we were in the communications business. And over time, their mission is still communications and connecting people, but their model changed from copper wires with Morse code to telephone wires to networking to cellular, right? And so if they would have said, no, what we do is we lay copper wires and we send pulses to telegraph machines, then we would not be talking about them today because they would not exist. But they recognized, for a variety of reasons, that they had to shift their models. And so what does that look like? In the organizational nonprofit context, it looks like understanding what your mission is, what you're trying to accomplish in the world, and how that is different than how you accomplish that mission. And the how might actually change.
So I'm imagining that for you as a consultant, No one needs a consultant when things tend to, well, at least they don't think they do. They don't need a consultant when things are going well. They're on the up curve, right? They reached the top. They don't even know they've reached the top yet because they think they're still going up. I'd imagine that you get called in mostly as the curve is dropping. There's a lack of resources or there's a lack of interest or whatever the ministry is, and how they justify what is good, how it's going well or not well. I'd imagine that you're coming in at the bottom end or as the curve is dropping. Where do you see most people getting stuck, most organizations? Like, what is it that's getting in the way that the curve has dropped? And what do you say when you come into that space and say, we need your help? Do they think they need your help in a different way to how you realize they need your help?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. The thing that I'm feel very blessed by is typically when I'm being brought in, the organization has not, they obviously have some hunches as to why maybe things aren't working well or what might create growth, of course, because they know their organization. But they tend to come with a pretty open mind to say, hey, look at what we're doing and then help us figure out how to grow. That's one of my most favorite things to do. Is that's just partly how God wired me. Is I like to understand how a thing works, how, whether it's a business or a nonprofit, what its economic engine is, like how does it create the resources to do what it does? And then how can we do more of that? And so typically I'm coming in to look at the organization across all of their resource development. And mostly in the case of nonprofits, that's fundraising, but that can also be services and products and subscriptions. And there are nonprofits that offer those sorts of things. And then what I'll do is I'll look at all of those programs and use discernment to help them understand where we should put our effort next. And I think, Jason, to your question, where organizations struggle does differ. But I will say one of the techniques that I use, I learned from some other authors named Dan and Chip Heath in a book called Made to Stick. Made to Stick is a book all about messages that resonate and stick, like stay with you. And so it's more of a communications and marketing book. Highly recommend it. But they wrote a follow-on book called Switch, which is about how to affect change when change is hard. And so they studied different situations in which organizations and institutions and communities and cultures had to go through very difficult periods of change. And they asked the question, what are lessons we can learn from that? And one of the lessons that they shared in the book that I've used for now maybe a decade is to look for the bright spots. And what they mean is in any situation where change is either needed or things are not going well, it's easy to get lost in a sea of sort of negative data. Well, this isn't working and that isn't working. And it can be really discouraging, Jason. But one of the things that they noticed in people that were successful at leading change was there are often very small pockets that are working surprisingly well. And they call those the bright spots. And so what I try to look for when I'm looking at an organization, especially when there's a discouraging overall trend, is I look for where are those little pockets of light where something's working really well. And leaders often are focused on problems, I got to deal with this problem or I have this big program that I'm working on. And so they can sometimes miss these bright spots. And it's like, well, but why is that working so well? What if we did 10 times more of that? And what might we be able to accomplish if we magnified that bright spot? And so some of what I do is just to help identify those bright spots. And it's like, ask the question, how can we do more of that? And it seems simple, but so often in a sea of, you're dealing with a lot of challenges and struggles and things like that, it can be easy to miss or to not see those bright spots.
I really appreciate the practical element that you've just introduced here, this idea of looking for bright spots. And I'd like to get a little bit more practical as we're drawing to the end of our interview. You coming in, you say one of the first things you help them do is you help them find bright spots. What are some other first steps that you do within an organization? So there's those who are listening, they're saying, I don't want my organization to die. I don't want my ministry. I want to keep growing. I want to keep innovating. I'm inspired. I hear you, Dave. What should I do next? What would you say to them?
That's a good question. So certainly looking for the bright spots is one. I do highly recommend the Working Genius model because every leadership team, every leader, and every organization tends to have strengths and weaknesses. And so it can be a really insightful exercise to see where your team might get stuck, candidly. And it's like I said, sometimes teams are stuck with their head in the clouds and they're always just wondering, well, what could be next, but then they don't take action, and vice versa. I've worked with teams that spend all their time with their, feet on the ground, doing stuff and getting stuff done, but they're missing the disruptions that are in front of them. So I would say those are two good next steps, because it just depends. Well, let me add one more thing. And I just wrote about this, and it's going to be in this upcoming WAVE report that comes out this next week. And that is from a mentor of mine, a gentleman who's mentored a lot of Christian and business leaders over many years. His name's Bob Biehl, by the way. Bob with 3 B's, B-O-B-B, Biehl, B-I-E-H-L, Bob Biehl. And Bob taught this to me many years ago, and that is that all planning begins with the invisible phrase, "at this stage in our development." And when he said that, I thought, what does that, at first I thought, what does that mean? And then I've realized that that is such a helpful recognition. And you said it even maybe 10 minutes ago, Jason. What you're doing today may not be the same thing you need to do tomorrow. And it may not be the same thing you did 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And so just to recognize that it begins with today. Where are you today? And where do you need to go? Not where have you been? I've certainly worked with organizations that spend a lot of time thinking about the good old days and, how wonderful it was when the internet didn't exist. And it's like, well, that's not today. What do we do with today? And how do we move forward from there? And so as you think about where you're at, it's that question of, at this stage in our development, fill in the blank. What's next?
So I had a question for those who are listening who might not be the senior leaders or on the board of the organization or the ministry, who find themselves maybe at the bottom of the ladder or maybe the middle rung, and they see the need for innovation. They see that their organization has reached their peak and is now heading in a down curve. What advice would you give to younger leaders or leaders in those positions who recognize the need for innovation, but find themselves in an environment where they cannot implement that and make it change within their organization? What would you say to them?
This is one of my favorite questions, because I think you can actually affect more innovation in many ways as a on the ground or middle, management leader than you can candidly as an executive. I remember my very first interview, Jason, many, many years ago when I was just out of college. And I remember the person who was interviewing me, the senior executive, and he said, "What do you want to be someday? What are you hoping? Do you want to be the president of this organization?" And I said, "Well, I don't know exactly, but I don't want to be the president because," and in my thought process at that time, the president doesn't seem to do anything. They just go to meetings and they talk to people, which, by the way, is not entirely untrue. There is a lot more influence. So when you're on the ground, you are getting to literally do the innovation. So that's a huge blessing to think about. And then the other, I'd say 2 more things. The other thing is, especially if you're a younger leader or you're newer to the organization, don't discount the power of being a fresh set of eyes. I talked about a lot of disruption and how that can be really hard to spot, especially when you've been in an organization for any number of years. My boss back at the agency always used to say that the half-life of objectivity is about 6 months. Meaning, when you start at an organization or in a new role, there's this period of time where you're like, why do we do it this way? And what is this really a constraint that we say we have, but is this true? And so if you are newer into a role, I would lean into that fresh set of eyes. Now, you also have to respect, and I've always had a deep appreciation for experience. And this is not licensed to be disrespectful or discount experience or history, but just know that you're going to bring a different perspective. So that's the second thing I would say. The third, I would say, is to think about being faithful in the little things. And I was just this morning reading in Luke 16. Jesus is speaking and he's talking about just pulling it up here, the parable of the dishonest manager. And in Luke 16, verse 10, he says, almost in passing, but he says, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. But he adds, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. And I am definitely guilty of being a big planner and always thinking about what's next and what's coming up and what I should focus on. But one of the things I feel like I'm continually challenged is to say, how do I be faithful in what's in front of me today? I have these two things that I need to focus on today. What does faithfulness look like to those things? And then these other things, they will come in time. But I keep going back to your point, Jason, of the big leader in front of the stage. And I've done the same thing. We put them up on a pedestal and we think, wow, look at all the great things they've done. Well, number one, they're human. They're not any different than you or I. They're no closer to Jesus than you or I. But number two, what they've probably done is 10,000 little things, not one big thing that put them on a stage. And so what does it look like to be faithful in the little things?
Wow, Dave, this conversation has been so rich. Not only have you helped us think through innovation, but you've also shared some wisdom with us that I think is worth pondering on and worth meditating on as we think about our own ministries and our own organizations that we serve and our place within them. Before we close, I have to ask you a question about trends. You mentioned the Wave Report, which I'd encourage others to go and subscribe to. We'll share it in the show notes a little bit later. But looking forward, what emerging trends should nonprofit leaders or ministry leaders be aware of to stay relevant, I'm using that word very lightly, and impactful in their mission?
Two trends come to mind. One is maybe a little bit more geographically specific, and then one is more global. So the geographically specific trend that I've been seeing, at least in North America, is the subscription economy and what it has been doing, not just in terms of how people are, paying on a monthly basis for services like Amazon Prime or Netflix, but also for how it has changed the way donors think about funding mission. And more donors are comfortable with giving or subscribing, air quotes, to causes that matter to them on a regular recurring basis, which, by the way, I think is a huge blessing for organizations that are looking to raise support. Anybody listening here who has raised support knows that dreaded feeling on January 1st when the clock restarts and you've got to raise all the money again, for the mission that you're trying to accomplish for this year. And so I think recurring giving, we've seen time and time again, especially in the last couple of years, that even as there have been instability in donations overall, the area that's been growing year after year has been recurring, regular giving. Now, I know those of our friends in Europe, for example, that's been a thing for years. So it's more of a growing trend in the US and Canada. And so I can't speak to that worldwide, but so that's one trend I would look at, subscriptions. And I write about that all the time. If you're interested, you're certainly welcome to subscribe. And then the other trend, though, I think that is much more global and much more present is how we can leverage artificial intelligence for, candidly, the glory of God. I gave a talk at a recent conference called Leveraging AI for God's Glory. And there's a lot being said about artificial intelligence. And I think a lot of it is highly philosophical and maybe even a little too technological. And so I'm mostly interested in how leaders can use the tool today to do what they're doing better. And I also write about that regularly if you're interested in it. I actually have a guide I can give you a link to, Jason, called 12 Ways to Leverage AI in 2024, with just 12 different use cases, how to use AI for brainstorming, how to use AI for copy editing or design. And if listeners are interested, maybe we can include a link to that.
Dave, that's really, really helpful. I made a note that we can put that into the show notes. As people have been listening, I'm sure that they're interested in connecting with you, finding out more about your consulting work. how can people connect with you online, find out more about the work that you do, connect with some of your resources?
So you can certainly check out our website. The company that I founded, the advisory firm, is called Imago Consulting. And yes, that is Latin, Imago, Imago, and that is a reference to Genesis 1:27. God created us in his image, the Imago Dei. And so Imago Consulting, and the website address is imago.consulting. So not .com, it's imago.consulting. If you use LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn, and you can just find me there at Dave Raley. And those are the two main places that I'll post and write and, post articles and things like that. And then the last piece that I would suggest, you mentioned the podcast at the beginning. I do co-host a podcast called the Purpose and Profit Podcast. And the URL for that is purposeandprofitpodcast.com. You can search that at any of the podcast feeds if you're interested.
Fantastic. I'll also include in the show notes. Dave, thanks so much for that. Before we close off, do you have any last words or words of encouragement that you'd like to share with the audience?
I think I would say this. I would say that I believe that we're on a journey of understanding who we were made to be. And that includes, by the way, our strengths and our weaknesses, our inherent, who God created us to be. But we've also been placed into a context. We've been born at a time in history. You were born in a specific place in the world, to a specific family, in a specific context, and he's placed you there for a reason. And that context changes throughout our life as we grow and as we have lived experiences, both good experiences, by the way, and the bad experiences that have shaped who we are. And I believe that faithfulness looks like the intersection of who we were created to be and the context in which we were placed in. And so if we go all the way back to Mr. Martin Luther, 500 and some years ago, living out his context, I would just encourage you as a leader, think about what time in history have you been placed and who have you been created to be, and what does faithfulness look like in that intersection?
Dave, with those final words, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, sharing your expertise with innovation and organizational growth.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Jason. I love the work of Lausanne. I first got involved maybe 15 years ago. And every time, by the way, I'll tell you this, every time I feel like, Lord, I don't know what certainly I have to bring. And I certainly don't know, how you'll connect this, but every time I've been just so encouraged. And so just love what you all are doing, and so excited for Soul and the events coming up, and just looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thank you for the shout out. Dave, truly appreciate you. Really feel like this has added value to those who listen. So thank you for your time.